In the year 1624, a company of merchants in Amsterdam planted a colony on the edge of a vast continent. They called it New Amsterdam. Few knew then that this small settlement would one day grow into one of the greatest cities in the world. That is where our story begins. But before we step into the streets of New Amsterdam, we must understand the company that built it, the Dutch West India Company. Why did they come? What did they want? And what challenges did they face from the very first day? Let us walk slowly into this history, one layer at a time. The Dutch West India Company was established in June 3, 1621, during a time of war and ambition. It was not just a group of merchants trading across the seas. It was a chartered company, created by the States General of the Netherlands, the highest governing body of the Dutch Republic. The charter gave the company sweeping powers, the right to wage war, to make treaties, to build forts, and to govern colonies. In other words, it was both a business and a government, a tool of profit and a weapon of empire. Its mission was clear and bold: dominate trade in the Atlantic Ocean, weaken Spain's empire, and expand Dutch influence in the Americas and Africa. This was no small task. Spain was the strongest empire of the time, ruling vast territories in the Americas, the Caribbean, and beyond. The Dutch were rising, but they were still fighting for independence in the long 80 Years' War against Spain. The company was created as part of that struggle. It was meant to strike Spain where it hurt most: its trade routes and colonies. The company wanted riches. They dreamed of gold from Mexico, silver from Peru, sugar from Brazil, and furs from North America. Investors in Amsterdam imagined ships returning heavy with treasure. But what did they actually find in North America? Not gold, not silver, something else: furs, beaver pelts. Beaver pelts were treasures in Europe. They were used to make fine felt hats, a symbol of wealth and fashion. Demand was high, and supply was limited. The rivers and forests of the Hudson Valley were rich with beaver. Native peoples trapped them and traded them. The Dutch saw opportunity, and so the company turned its eyes to the Hudson River, to the land that would become New Netherland, and to the small settlement that would grow into New Amsterdam. But who carried this dream across the ocean? Not the directors sitting in Amsterdam. It was the settlers, the sailors, the traders, the families who risked everything to cross the Atlantic. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company made its first serious move to plant a colony in North America. They sent about 30 families, many of them Walloons, French-speaking Protestants from present-day Belgium who had fled religious persecution in Europe. These families were not sent to one single place. Instead, the company spread them across several sites, hoping to secure different regions at once. The company wanted to claim as much land as possible to show strength against rivals. But the reality? Spreading settlers thin made them vulnerable. Fort Orange, near present-day Albany. Some families were sent up the Hudson River to Fort Orange. This was close to the fur trade with the Mohawk and other Iroquois peoples. It was a strategic choice because furs were the company's main treasure, but life there was hard. The fort was small, the winters were cold, and settlers depended on native allies for survival. Fort Nassau, on the Delaware River. Another group was sent south, near present-day Gloucester, New Jersey. This was an attempt to control trade along the Delaware River, but the location was poor. Floods damaged the fort, and settlers struggled to survive. Within a few years, Fort Nassau was abandoned. Governor's Island, near Manhattan. Some families were placed on Governor's Island, just across the water from Manhattan. This was a temporary camp, a stepping stone before moving to the southern tip of Manhattan itself. Other scattered sites. A few families were placed along the Connecticut River, near present-day Hartford, but this was dangerous. English settlers from New England were already moving into the area. Conflict soon followed, and the Dutch withdrew. The company tried to claim many places at once, but none of them seemed secure. Where would the true center of the colony be? By 1625, the company realized that Manhattan Island was the key. Why? Because it controlled the mouth of the Hudson River. Whoever held Manhattan could control all trade flowing in and out of the valley. The harbor was deep, perfect for ships, the land was fertile enough for farming, and it was defensible, surrounded by water. So the settlers were gathered from scattered sites and moved to Manhattan. Whoever held Manhattan could control all trade going in and out of the river valley. Ships could anchor safely in its deep harbor. From there, goods could flow to Europe. That was the secret. That was the reason New Amsterdam was born. In 1625, construction began at Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan. It was a wooden fort at first, later rebuilt in stone. Around it, houses and farms grew. The settlement was small, but it had a purpose: protect trade, guard the river, and serve as the center of Dutch power in North America. The company thought it was building a fortress of profit, but in reality, it was planting the seed of a city that would one day grow far beyond their imagination. Now let us pause. Imagine the scene in the mid-1620s. A small group of settlers, Dutch and Walloon families, standing at the southern edge of Manhattan Island. The land was wild. Thick forests covered the hills. Marshes lay near the shoreline. The air was damp with the smell of salt water from the harbor. Native Americans, the Lenape, lived nearby in villages scattered across the island and along the rivers. The settlers built simple huts at first, made of wood and bark. Then they began to raise a fort. They called it Fort Amsterdam, built in 1625 to 1626. At first it was a wooden palisade, later strengthened with stone. It stood at the southern edge of Manhattan, where today's Battery Park is located. The fort was the heart of the colony. Inside were storehouses, barracks, and the governor's residence. Around it, the colony grew, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. The company wasn't just about trade, it was about power. The Dutch West India Company wanted to show Spain and England that they could hold territory in North America. They wanted to prove that the Dutch Republic, though small, could plant its flag across the ocean. But holding territory meant facing challenges. What were those challenges? Let us uncover them. Challenge 1: Native Peoples. The land was not empty. The Lenape lived there. They had villages, farms, and hunting grounds. They grew corn, beans, and squash. They fished in rivers and hunted in forests. Their world was rich and balanced. At first, relations were peaceful. The Dutch traded with them. Iron tools, beads, cloth, and firearms were exchanged for furs. The Lenape valued these goods. The Dutch valued beaver pelts, which were in high demand in Europe. But peace was fragile. The Dutch believed in ownership of land. The Lenape believed in shared use of land. Misunderstandings grew, suspicion grew, and soon conflict would come. That is a story we will explore in later chapters. Challenge 2: Too few settlers. The colony was small. In 1626, New Amsterdam had fewer than 300 people. Most were men. Soldiers, sailors, traders. Families were few, farms were few. The company wanted profits, but it did not want to spend too much money on settlers. Recruiting colonists was expensive. Many Dutch preferred to stay in the Netherlands, where life was safer and more prosperous. So the colony was always short of people. This weakness haunted New Amsterdam for decades. It meant farms were small, defenses were weak, and the settlement grew slowly compared to English colonies. Challenge 3: Company Rule. The Dutch West India Company was run by directors in Amsterdam, far away across the ocean. They cared more about profits than about the daily lives of settlers. They sent orders, demanded taxes, and expected obedience. But they did not understand the struggles of life in the colony. This gap between company and colony created tension. Who would make decisions? Who would lead? Would it be the settlers who lived the hardships, or the directors who counted the profits? That question would shape the history of New Amsterdam. Now, let us meet a key figure, Peter Minuit. He arrived in 1626 as director of New Netherland. He was a skilled administrator chosen to bring order to the colony. He is remembered for one famous act, the purchase of Manhattan Island. The story says he bought it from the Lenape for goods worth 60 guilders. That amount has often been compared to about $24 in 19th century money, though in reality it was closer to hundreds of dollars in today's value. The goods included tools, cloth, beads, and other trade items. Was this a fair deal? Historians debate it. Some say the Lenape did not understand the idea of selling land. They thought they were sharing it, allowing the Dutch to use it alongside them. Others say the Dutch took advantage of cultural differences. Whatever the truth, that moment became a symbol. It showed how the Dutch claimed the land and how misunderstandings with native peoples began. Peter Minuit's leadership did not last. He was removed in 1631. Why? Because of disputes with the company directors. This shows us something important. The colony's leaders were always at risk of being replaced if they did not please the company. Power was fragile, authority was contested, and this would lead to many controversies in the years ahead. Let us step back. What was New Amsterdam in these early years? It was a small fort, a few houses, a trading post. Ships came and went, furs were shipped to Europe, settlers tried to farm, Native Americans traded. But beneath this simple picture, tensions were rising. The company wanted profits, the settlers wanted stability, the native peoples wanted respect. These three forces pulled against each other, and sooner or later, something had to break. At first, the Dutch and the Lenape traded peacefully. Iron tools, cloth, and beads were exchanged for beaver pelts. Both sides gained. But beneath this trade, mistrust grew. The Dutch thought in terms of ownership. The Lenape thought in terms of sharing. This difference was not small. It was a deep cultural divide. Peace would not last, and indeed, by the 1640s, war broke out. The most infamous conflict in New Amsterdam's history was Kieft's War, 1643 to 1645. Willem Kieft, the director of New Netherland, believed the colony needed more revenue to survive. The Dutch West India Company was pressing him for profits, and he thought he had found a solution: tax the native peoples. He demanded tribute in corn, furs, or wampum from the Lenape and other nearby tribes. The Lenape refused. They had traded willingly with the Dutch before, but they did not accept the idea of paying tribute. To them, it was insulting. They saw it as submission. Kieft, impatient and arrogant, decided to use force. In 1643, he ordered a tax on native villages near Pavonia, present-day Jersey City, and Corlier's Hook in Manhattan. The violence was brutal. Dutch soldiers killed men, women, and children. Some were slaughtered in their sleep. The attacks shocked even many settlers who had not wanted war. The Lenape struck back with fury. Farms were burned, settlers were killed, outlying communities were abandoned. Panic spread through New Amsterdam. Families crowded into Fort Amsterdam for safety. The colony lived in fear. This war nearly destroyed New Netherland. It showed how fragile the settlement was. It also revealed the arrogance of company leaders who thought they could impose taxes without understanding native customs. The settlers blamed Willem Kieft. They said his policies were reckless. They said he had brought war upon them. And they were right. Many settlers had opposed his plan from the beginning. They had warned him not to provoke the Lenape, but Kieft ignored them. In desperation, the settlers formed a council of 12 men in 1641, the first attempt at self-government in the colony. They advised Kieft against war, but he dismissed their advice. He dissolved the council when they opposed him. This deepened resentment. The company directors in Amsterdam did not care much about the settlers' suffering. They cared about profits. They cared about control. They saw Kieft's war as a failure, but they did not feel the settlers' pain. By 1645, the war ended with a fragile peace, but the colony was devastated. Farms lay in ruins, trade had collapsed, trust between settlers and native peoples was broken. Kieft's reputation was destroyed. Settlers demanded his removal. They sent petitions to Amsterdam describing his reckless leadership. The company listened. So who would replace Kieft? Who would restore order? That question hung in the air. The company sent Stuyvesant in 1646. He was strict, proud, and uncompromising. He had lost a leg in battle and walked with a wooden peg. He believed in discipline. He believed in order. And he believed in the authority of the Dutch West India Company. Stuyvesant would bring stability, but the reality? His rule was harsh. He clashed with settlers. He clashed with religious minorities. He clashed with anyone who challenged company authority. Yet, he did bring some order. He repaired defenses. He strengthened Fort Amsterdam. He tried to regulate trade. He tried to keep peace with native peoples after the chaos of Kieft's War. But controversy followed him everywhere. One of the greatest controversies in New Amsterdam was religion. The Dutch Reformed Church was the official faith, supported by the Dutch West India Company. Ministers were appointed, services were held in Dutch, and attendance was expected. But settlers came from many backgrounds: Lutherans from Germany, Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, Quakers from England, and others. New Amsterdam could have been a place of tolerance, reflecting the diversity of its people. But the reality? Under Peter Stuyvesant, religion became a source of conflict. Stuyvesant wanted strict control. He believed the colony should follow the Dutch Reformed Church alone. He banned public worship outside it. He fined or punished those who gathered in private homes for Lutheran services. He persecuted Quakers who rejected formal church authority. He tried to expel Jews who had arrived in 1654 after fleeing Portuguese rule in Brazil. This created tension. Settlers wanted freedom. They argued that the colony's strength came from diversity. They petitioned the company directors in Amsterdam. The directors were often more tolerant than Stuyvesant. For example, when Stuyvesant tried to expel Jews in 1654, the directors stopped him. They said Jews could stay as long as they did not become a burden on the colony. They reminded Stuyvesant that Jewish investors had helped finance the company itself. This decision allowed Jews to remain in New Amsterdam, laying the foundation for one of the earliest Jewish communities in North America. Another case came in 1657, when settlers in Flushing, Queens, signed the Flushing Remonstrance. This was a petition demanding religious freedom, especially for Quakers. It was one of the first documents in American history to defend liberty of conscience. Stuyvesant rejected it, but the protest showed how deeply settlers valued freedom. Who had the right to govern? Was it the company, enforcing strict rules? Was it the settlers, demanding freedom? Or was it the directors in Amsterdam, balancing profit with tolerance? This shows us something important. New Amsterdam was not just a colony. It was a place where questions of freedom and authority were tested. Who had the right to worship freely? Who had the right to govern? These questions echoed long after the Dutch were gone. They became part of New York's identity, and later, part of America's struggle for religious liberty. Here is another controversy, often forgotten yet central to the story of New Amsterdam: slavery. The Dutch West India Company brought enslaved Africans to the colony as early as 1626, only 2 years after the first settlers arrived. These men and women were forced to work on farms, in households, and on public projects. They cleared land, built roads, repaired Fort Amsterdam, and labored in the harshest conditions. Slavery was part of the colony from the beginning. The company relied on enslaved labor because settlers were few. Farming was hard, and construction required strength. Without enslaved Africans, the colony might not have survived its early years. Yet their lives were marked by cruelty. They had no freedom, no rights, and no control over their families. In 1644, a group of enslaved Africans petitioned for release. They argued that they had served the company faithfully for many years. Their request was unusual, but the company faced pressure. It needed settlers to farm land and pay taxes, so the directors granted them a compromise known as half-freedom. What did half-freedom mean? These Africans were allowed to farm their own land and live independently. They could build homes, raise families, and sell crops. But they were not fully free. They had to pay an annual tax to the company, often in grain, livestock, or wampum. They also had to work for the company whenever called upon. And most cruel of all, their children remained enslaved. This half-freedom was unique in colonial America. It showed both the cruelty of slavery and the strange compromises of the company. It gave hope to some, but it kept families trapped in bondage. It revealed the colony's dependence on enslaved labor, while also showing how enslaved Africans carved out space for survival and community. What happened to those half-free families? They built farms north of the main settlement in what is now Greenwich Village. Their land became some of the first black-owned property in New York. They formed a small but resilient community. Yet their children remained enslaved, and slavery continued to expand in the colony. By the 1650s, enslaved Africans made up a significant part of New Amsterdam's population. They worked in households, on farms, and in public works. Their labor was essential, but their freedom was denied. By the 1650s, tension between settlers and the company grew stronger. Settlers wanted more voice. They wanted to elect representatives. They wanted to make local laws. But Stuyvesant resisted. He said authority belonged to the company. In 1647, settlers formed the Nine Men, a council to advise the director, but their power was limited. They complained to Amsterdam about Stuyvesant's harsh rule. They said the colony needed more freedom. This was the beginning of a struggle that would continue until the English takeover. Settlers wanted self-government. The company wanted control. Suspense was rising. Who would win? By the end of the 1650s, New Amsterdam was still small. Maybe 1,500 people lived there. The streets were muddy. The houses were simple. The fort was strong, but not enough to stop a major attack. The colony was fragile. It was caught between native peoples, English colonies to the north and south, and the demands of the company across the ocean. The English crown claimed all lands from New England to Virginia. That included New Netherland. They said the Dutch had no right to be there. They wanted control of the Hudson River, the fur trade, and the harbor of New Amsterdam. In 1664, King Charles II gave his brother, the Duke of York, a grant of all Dutch lands in North America. This was not just a threat, it was a plan. The English would take New Amsterdam. Suspense grew. Would the Dutch resist? Would the company send reinforcements? Would Stuyvesant fight? In August 1664, 4 English warships sailed into New York Harbor. They anchored off Staten Island. Their cannons pointed toward New Amsterdam. The settlers watched in fear. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. He believed in defending the colony. He tried to rally the settlers. He told them to stand firm. The settlers did not want war. They were tired of company rule. They were tired of harsh laws. They were tired of being ignored by Amsterdam. The settlers saw the English as a chance for more freedom. They refused to fight. On September 8, 1664, Stuyvesant surrendered New Amsterdam to the English. No shots were fired. No blood was spilled. The colony passed from Dutch to English hands in a single day. The English renamed it New York in honor of the Duke of York. The Dutch West India Company lost its jewel in North America. The company's ambition had failed. Its weakness had been exposed. Its settlers had chosen peace over loyalty.